The blood-red sun hung low on the horizon as Yates Whitley galloped across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, 1878. The relentless summer heat had baked the earth hard as iron, but tonight promised relief as dark clouds gathered in the distance. Yates pulled his horse to a stop atop a small rise, removing his worn Stetson to wipe sweat from his brow. 26 years of hard living had etched lines around his eyes, but hadn't dimmed their intensity. As he surveyed the sprawling landscape, he spotted thin wisps of smoke rising from a small homestead in the valley below the Parkerson place. Zara Parkerson had arrived 3 months ago with nothing but determination and her father's old wagon. At 23, she'd inherited a patch of land from a distant uncle she'd never met. And while most folks gave the young woman from Boston less than a season before she'd run back east, Yates had recognized something in her that the others had missed: a quiet, unyielding strength. Replacing his hat, Yates nudged his stallion forward. He hadn't planned to stop by the Parkerson place, but something about those smoke signals seemed wrong, too thin, too sporadic. As a former scout for the cavalry, he'd learned to trust his instincts. The closer he got to the small cabin, the more his unease grew. No chickens pecking in the yard, no wash hanging on the line, no sign of Zara tending her small garden plot that she'd coaxed into existence against all odds. Miss Parkerson. Yates called out, dismounting and tethering his horse to the hitching post. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his Colt revolver. "Zara, you there?" A weak cough from inside the cabin sent him rushing through the door. The interior was dim, lit only by dying embers in the stone fireplace. Zara lay on her narrow bed, face flushed with fever, her normally vibrant features drawn with pain. "Yates," her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't expect anyone." He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" "Just a fever, it'll pass." She tried to sit up but collapsed back with a wince. "How long you been like this?" He reached for the water pitcher beside her bed, finding it empty. 2 days, maybe 3, lost track." She closed her eyes briefly. "The well, I couldn't make it to the well." Without hesitation, Yates grabbed the pitcher and strode outside. The well stood 30 yards from the cabin, and he worked the pump vigorously until cool water flowed. As he filled the pitcher, his eyes scanned the horizon. The nearest doctor was in Harmony Springs, a good day's ride away. Zara's condition didn't look good, but moving her might be worse. Back inside, he helped her drink, supporting her head with one hand. "Thank you," she murmured when she finished. "You shouldn't be here, people will talk." Yates almost smiled. Even half dead with fever, she worried about propriety. "Let them talk, I'm not leaving you like this." As night fell, her fever worsened. Yates built up the fire and searched her small cabin for anything that might help. In a trunk at the foot of her bed, he found a book of home remedies. By lamplight, he flipped through the pages until he found fever treatments. He spent hours applying cool compresses to her forehead, neck, and wrists, following the book's instructions. Around midnight, she began to thrash and mumble, lost in delirium. "They're coming," she whispered, eyes wide but unseeing. "They always come at night." "Who's coming, Zara?" Yates asked softly, replacing the compress on her forehead. The voices, the cries. She clutched at his arm with surprising strength. "They cry at night, Yates, can't you hear them?" He stilled, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. "I don't hear anything but the wind." She shook her head frantically. No, the women, the children, their voices carry on the night air. They've been crying since I arrived. No one believes me." Yates frowned. Zara had always struck him as level-headed, not given to flights of fancy, but fever could make people see and hear things that weren't there. "Try to rest," he said gently. "I'm right here." As the night deepened, her fever finally broke. She fell into a peaceful sleep just before dawn, her breathing steady and strong. Yates, exhausted from his vigil, slumped in the chair beside her bed and closed his eyes for just a moment. He woke with a start to the sound of sobbing, distant, ethereal, like nothing he'd ever heard before. It wasn't coming from Zara, who still slept peacefully. The crying seemed to float on the pre-dawn air, neither inside the cabin nor outside, but somehow all around them. Yates moved to the door, opening it quietly. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading. The crying stopped abruptly. He stood in the doorway, every sense alert, but heard nothing more than the usual sounds of early morning, a few birds, the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. He was about to close the door when he noticed something strange. At the edge of Zara's property, where her land met the rolling hills beyond, stood a lone figure. In the dim light, he couldn't make out much, just the silhouette of what appeared to be a woman in a long dress. As he watched, the figure turned and walked into the hills, disappearing from view. "Yates," Zara's voice called weakly from inside. "Is someone there?" He closed the door and returned to her side. "No one. How are you feeling?" "Better." She pushed herself up slightly against her pillow. "You stayed all night. Couldn't very well leave you to fend for yourself." He poured her some water. "You were talking in your sleep about crying at night." Her face paled. "You heard it too, didn't you, just now?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I heard something, and I'm not sure what I saw, a woman maybe at the edge of your property." Relief flooded her features. "I'm not crazy. Everyone in town thinks I am. I told Sheriff Tate about the crying, and he just patted my head like I was a child with nightmares." "What do you think it is?" Yates asked, pulling his chair closer. "I don't know." She looked down at her hands. "But it started the first week I arrived. Always at night, always the same crying. Women, children. Sometimes I think I hear men's voices too, deep in the background. Have you ever seen anyone?" She shook her head. "Just shadows sometimes at the edge of my vision. I've been afraid to investigate alone." Yates was quiet for a long moment. He wasn't superstitious by nature, but he'd spent enough time with native tribes during his scouting days to respect that there were things in this world not easily explained. "I'll help you find out what it is," he said finally. "But first, you need to get your strength back." Over the next 3 days, Yates stayed at Zara's place, sleeping in the barn to maintain her reputation. He hunted rabbit and prairie hen, making hearty stews to help her recover. Each night as darkness fell, they heard the crying, sometimes faint, sometimes so clear it seemed to fill the cabin. On the 4th day, Zara was strong enough to sit on the porch. The summer sun warmed her face as she sipped tea from a chipped cup. "Why did you come west?" Yates asked, whittling a piece of wood beside her. "Boston society to Wyoming Territory is quite a change," she smiled faintly. "There was nothing left for me in Boston. My parents died in a fire 2 years ago. I was teaching at a ladies' academy, but..." She trailed off, but it wasn't living. "It was existing." She set her cup down. "When I received the letter about my uncle's property, it seemed like a sign, a chance to build something that was truly mine." Yates nodded. He understood the appeal of starting fresh better than most. "And the crying, when did it first start?" "The 3rd night after I arrived. I was still sleeping in my wagon while clearing the cabin. At first I thought it was coyotes or wolves, but..." She shivered despite the warmth. "It's human, Yates. Those are human voices." That night they decided to investigate. As dusk settled over the land, they prepared. Yates checked his revolver and slung a rifle over his shoulder. Zara dressed in practical trousers and a sturdy jacket, her hair braided tightly. "Are you sure you're strong enough for this?" he asked as they stood at her door. "I need to know." Her voice was firm. "I can't live with this mystery hanging over me." They waited on the porch, speaking little, watching as the sky transitioned from orange to deep blue to the velvety black of a moonless night. The first hour passed in silence, then another. "Maybe they won't," Yates began, but Zara's hand gripped his arm. "Listen," she whispered. At first he heard nothing. Then it came a low keening that raised the hair on his neck. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal. It was unmistakably human grief carried on the night air. Yates lit the lantern he'd prepared. "Stay close." They moved together across Zara's yard toward the source of the sound. As they walked, the crying grew louder, more distinct. Yates could now make out what sounded like words, though in a language he didn't recognize. The crying led them to the edge of Zara's property, where the flat farmland began to roll into hills. In the darkness, they could see nothing unusual, but the sounds were clearly coming from just beyond the first rise. "There," Zara pointed suddenly. Yates raised the lantern. In its flickering light, they saw what looked like disturbed earth, a long, rectangular depression in the ground. partially overgrown with grass but unmistakable to anyone who'd seen battle. "A grave," he said quietly, but as they moved closer, they realized it wasn't just one grave. The hillside was dotted with similar depressions, some barely visible under the prairie grass, others more recent. "My God," Zara breathed. "There must be dozens." The crying had stopped. The night was eerily silent as they stood among what they now realized was an unmarked cemetery. "Who are they?" Zara asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are they buried here with no markers?" Yates knelt beside one of the depressions, feeling the earth with his hand. "I don't know, but someone does." They returned to the cabin in somber silence, the weight of their discovery heavy between them. As they reached the porch, Zara turned to Yates, her face pale in the lantern light. Someone in town must know something about this land, about what happened here. "I'll ride into Harmony Springs tomorrow," he agreed. "Talk to some of the old-timers." That night, for the first time since Yates had arrived, the crying didn't return. They sat by the fire late into the night, speaking of their discoveries and of themselves. Zara told him more about her life in Boston, about the suffocating expectations placed on a young woman of her status. Yates shared stories of his time as a scout, of the beauty and harshness of the territories he'd traversed. "You never speak of family," she observed as the fire burned low. Yates stared into the embers. "Not much to tell. Father was a drunk who left when I was 10. Mother worked herself to death by the time I was 16. Joined the cavalry the day after we buried her." Without thinking, Zara reached across and took his hand. The simple gesture carried more comfort than any words could have. They sat that way for a long while, connected in the quiet of the night, until finally Zara's eyes grew heavy with sleep. "You should rest," Yates said, reluctantly withdrawing his hand. "I'll head to town at first light." Harmony Springs was a 2-hour ride from Zara's homestead. The small but growing town consisted of one main street with the usual establishments: general store, saloon, blacksmith, small church, and a handful of other businesses. Yates tied his horse outside the Broken Spoke saloon, which despite the early hour already had several patrons. Inside, he found who he was looking for. Old Pete Hansen sat at his usual corner table, nursing what everyone knew was coffee laced with whiskey. At 82, Pete was the oldest resident of Harmony Springs and its unofficial historian. "Morning, Pete," Yates said, pulling up a chair. Pete's roomy eyes brightened with recognition. "Whitley, ain't seen you in a spell, been busy. Mind if I ask you something about the territory?" Pete gestured expansively. "Ask away, got nowhere to be." "The Parkerson place, about 10 miles east. What do you know about that land?" Pete's weathered face grew still. He took a long sip of his drink before answering. "Why you asking? Just curious." "Been helping Miss Parkerson with some repairs." "Bet that ain't all you been helping her with," Pete cackled, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. "The land, Pete," Yates pressed. The old man sighed. "That land's got history, bad history." Surprised they sold it to some eastern gal who wouldn't know. "Know what?" Pete leaned forward. "Winter of '58, worst blizzard these parts ever seen. There was a Cheyenne camp in those hills, women, children, old ones. The men were away hunting." Yates felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What happened?" "Militia from the fort, drunk on whiskey and rumors about raids, found the camp. Claimed later they thought it was a war party." Pete shook his head. "Weren't no warriors there, just families. They killed them. Every last one, 47 souls. The army hushed it up, buried them where they fell, and forbade anyone to mark the graves or speak of it." Pete's voice had dropped to a whisper. "Land passed to the government, then to homesteaders who never stayed long. Place has a reputation for being haunted," Yates said quietly. Pete nodded. "Some say on certain nights you can hear them crying, the victims, especially the children." Yates thanked Pete and left him to his memories. His next stop was the land office, where after some persuasion and a few dollars, he was allowed to see the records for Zara's property. The history confirmed Pete's story. The land had changed hands 6 times in 20 years, with no owner staying longer than a season. The records were vague about why the properties were abandoned, but reading between the lines, Yates could guess. The last owner, Zara's uncle, had purchased the land but never actually lived on it. Before leaving town, Yates visited the general store for supplies. As he was paying, the storekeeper, Samuel Finch, made conversation. "Haven't seen the Parkerson woman in nearly 2 weeks. She all right. Had a fever, but she's recovering," Yates replied. Finch nodded sagely. "Thought she might have finally fled. Most do once they hear them." "Hear who?" Finch glanced around, though they were alone in the store. "The dead. That land's got a curse on it. Tried to warn her when she first came to town, but she just smiled like I was telling tall tales. You know what happened there? In '58, everyone knows, no one talks about it." Finch handed Yates his change. "Tell her to sell. Some things can't be fixed with hard work and good intentions." Yates rode back to the homestead with a heavy heart. The story weighed on him, as did the decision of whether to tell Zara everything. He found her in the garden, her color much improved, kneeling among rows of young vegetables. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You found something?" It wasn't a question. He nodded, helping her to her feet. Together they walked to the porch, where he told her everything he'd learned. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "So I'm living on a massacre site," she finally said. "Those poor people. The townsfolk think you should sell, move on. Do you think that too?" Her eyes met his directly. Yates considered his answer carefully. "I think most would. It's not going to be easy living with this knowledge, with what you hear every night. And yet people live on battlefields all across this country, on lands where terrible things happened." She looked out over her small farm. "Running away won't help those souls rest." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm staying." Her voice was firm. "This is my home now. But I think we owe those people something." That evening, as the sun set, Zara explained her idea. They would properly mark the graves, learn the names of those who died if possible, and create a memorial. It wouldn't change what had happened, but it might help bring peace to both the living and the dead. Yates agreed to help, though he had doubts about whether it would stop the nightly cries. They decided to start the next day, mapping the grave sites they'd found and searching for any others. That night, they sat on the porch waiting for darkness to fall. The air was unusually still, heavy with the promise of rain that hadn't yet come. When the first stars appeared, they heard it again, the crying, more distinct than ever before. "They cry at night," Yates said softly, echoing her words from her delirium. She reached for his hand in the darkness. "Then let them hear my voice too." Before he could stop her, Zara stood and walked into the yard. In the moonlight, he could see her clearly as she faced the direction of the hills where the graves lay. "I know what happened to you," she called out, her voice strong and clear in the night air. "I know the wrong that was done. I promise you will not be forgotten again." The crying continued, but it seemed to Yates that it changed, somehow less anguished, more like a response to her words. "This is your land," she continued. "I'm just its caretaker. I will honor your memory and make sure others know of you." As she spoke, the clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened. Rain began to fall, gently at first, then in earnest. The crying faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of water hitting earth. Yates joined Zara in the yard, rain soaking them both. "Come inside," he said, touching her elbow. She turned to him, face wet with rain and tears. "Did you hear how they changed? When I spoke to them," he nodded. In truth, he'd heard it clearly, the shift from mourning to something almost like acknowledgement. Over the following weeks, Yates and Zara worked to fulfill her promise. They carefully marked each grave site they could find with simple wooden crosses. Yates rode to Fort Laramie, where after much persistence, he obtained a partial list of the victims' names from a sympathetic clerk who allowed him to view restricted records. They placed a larger marker at the center of the burial ground, with as many names as they had been able to learn. Zara planted wildflowers among the graves, transforming the site from a hidden tragedy to a peaceful memorial. The crying didn't stop entirely, but it changed. It came less frequently, and when it did, it was quieter, less anguished. Sometimes now they heard what sounded like singing distant, ethereal lullabies carried on the night wind. As they worked together, something shifted between Yates and Zara as well. The shared purpose, the shared secret of what they heard each night, created a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Yates no longer slept in the barn, but took up residence in a small lean-to he built beside the cabin, close enough for propriety's sake, yet near enough that they could speak late into the evening through the open window. Summer gave way to early autumn. Zara's garden yielded its first modest harvest, the memorial was complete, and still Yates remained, finding endless tasks to justify his continued presence. "You don't have to keep making excuses to stay," Zara said one evening as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "Just say you want to." Yates looked up, surprised by her directness. "And if I do want to stay, then stay." Her eyes met his steadily. "I've grown used to having you here. That all it is, being used to me." He set the bowl of peas aside, a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "No, that's not all it is." That night, for the first time, they heard no crying. The only sounds were the usual night creatures, the rustle of wind through the tall grass, and the distant rumble of thunder from a storm passing to the north. In the morning, Yates rode into town to send a telegram. He returned by mid-afternoon to find Zara waiting anxiously on the porch. "Where did you go?" she asked as he dismounted. "I was worried, had business to attend to." He joined her on the porch, unusually solemn. "What kind of business?" Instead of answering, he took her hands in his. "Zara, I've been drifting most of my life, never stayed anywhere longer than the job required, never wanted to." She waited, hardly daring to breathe. "But these past weeks with you, I've found something I never knew I was missing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple ring. "I sent a telegram to the circuit preacher. He'll be through these parts in 2 weeks' time." Zara's eyes widened. "Yates, I know it's sudden, I know we've known each other barely 4 months, but I also know I love you, Zara Parkerson. And if you'll have me, I want to build a life here with you." Tears filled her eyes. "The crying, the history of this place doesn't frighten you away. Those spirits led me to you." He squeezed her hands gently. "I think they want life here again, real life with a family and future." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Yates Whitley." They were married on the first day of October 1878, on the porch of the cabin they now shared. The circuit preacher, Reverend Thomas, performed a simple ceremony witnessed by a few townsfolk brave enough to visit the haunted homestead and old Pete Hansen, who surprised everyone by presenting the couple with a handcrafted quilt. That night, as husband and wife, they lay in the darkness of their cabin listening to the sounds of the prairie. "It's so quiet," Zara whispered. "Do you think they're finally at peace?" "Maybe," Yates pulled her closer. "Or maybe they're just giving us this night." As if in answer, they heard a new sound, not crying or singing, but what sounded like children's laughter, distant and fleeting, like an echo from another time. Zara smiled in the darkness. "I think that's their blessing." Winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving. Yates and Zara weathered it together in their snug cabin, planning improvements for the spring, reading aloud to each other in the evenings, and occasionally still hearing the voices on the wind, no longer crying, but singing, talking, living their parallel existence alongside the young couple. By February, Zara had news that brought joy to them both. She was expecting their first child, due in late summer. As her body changed with the growing life inside her, the spirits seemed to respond. Often now, they would feel a presence in the cabin, nothing frightening, just a sense that they were not alone, that they were being watched over. "I think they're protecting us," Zara said one night as Yates placed his hand on her growing belly. "Especially the baby." Yates, once skeptical of such things, could only nod in agreement. He'd come to accept that their homestead existed in a unique space between worlds, and that somehow they had been chosen as its caretakers. Spring brought new life to the prairie and new energy to their work. Yates expanded the garden, built a proper barn, and added a room to the cabin for the coming child. Zara planted flowers around the memorial site and continued to research the names of those who had died there, adding to the marker whenever she confirmed a new identity. In late April, they received an unexpected visitor. A Cheyenne elder named Two Hawks arrived at their homestead, accompanied by a young translator. The old man had heard stories of what they had done for the massacre victims and had traveled many days to see for himself. Zara welcomed them into their home, serving coffee and fresh bread while the translator explained the elder's purpose. He says his grandmother and 2 aunts died in the massacre, the young man translated. He has carried their memory all his life but never knew where their bodies lay. Yates nodded respectfully to the elder. We've tried to honor all who died here. We would be grateful if he could help us identify more of the victims. 2 Hawks listened to the translation, then spoke at length, his weathered face solemn. He says the dead were restless because they were forgotten, the translator said. Their story was erased. By remembering them, by speaking their names, you have helped their spirits find peace. 2 Hawks stayed for 3 days, walking the memorial grounds, praying in his language, and sharing what he knew of those who had died. Before he left, he performed a ceremony at the site, a ritual of cleansing and blessing that Yates and Zara were invited to witness but not participate in. As the elder prepared to depart, he took Zara's hands and placed them on her swollen belly, speaking directly to her. He says your child will be born with a special connection to this place, the translator explained. A bridge between worlds, the spirits will watch over this child always. After 2 Hawks left, the homestead felt different. The atmosphere was lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. The voices still came occasionally, but they were peaceful now, conversations, laughter, songs that floated on the night air like distant memories. In August, as the wheat in their small field turned golden, Zara went into labor. The nearest midwife was in town, and though Yates rode like the wind to fetch her, he feared they wouldn't return in time. To his surprise, when he arrived back at the cabin with the midwife, he found Zara calm and composed despite her labor pains. She swore that she hadn't been alone, that she had felt hands supporting her back, heard voices encouraging her in a language she didn't understand but somehow comprehended. Their daughter was born as the sun set, a strong, healthy girl with her mother's determined chin and her father's intense eyes. They named her Hope, a testament to what had brought them together and sustained them through their unusual circumstances. That night, as Zara slept with the baby cradled beside her, Yates stepped outside into the warm summer darkness. The stars blazed overhead, countless points of light in the vast prairie sky. From the direction of the memorial came the sound of singing women's voices raised in what he now recognized as a Cheyenne lullaby. "Thank you," he said aloud to the night, "for guiding us here, for bringing us together, for watching over my family." The singing continued, neither acknowledging his words nor ignoring them, simply existing alongside him in the shared space of their unusual home. As the years passed, the Whitley homestead prospered. They added a second child, a son named William, 2 years after Hope's birth. The children grew up aware of the special nature of their home, accepting the occasional voices and ethereal music as simply part of their world. Hope, as 2 Hawks had predicted, seemed to have a particular connection to the spirits. She often spoke of the other children she played with in the hills, describing games and songs that neither Yates nor Zara had taught her. Far from being frightened, she seemed to draw strength from these unseen companions. The town's attitude toward the Whitley place gradually shifted from fear to cautious respect. The story of what Yates and Zara had done honoring the dead rather than fleeing from them spread throughout the territory. Occasionally, Cheyenne travelers would stop at their farm, bringing gifts and spending time at the memorial grounds. By 1888, their homestead had grown into a prosperous small farm. They had added sheep and cattle to their holdings, and Zara had started a school in one room of their now expanded home, teaching both their children and those from neighboring farms. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching 10-year-old Hope and 8-year-old William chase fireflies in the twilight, Zara leaned against Yates's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Staying here dealing with all of this?" She gestured vaguely toward the hills where the memorial stood. Yates wrapped an arm around her. "Not for a single moment. This land brought us together. These spirits, whatever they are, they're part of our family now." She smiled, watching as Hope seemed to pause and listen to something only she could hear before laughing and running in a new direction. "They've been quieter lately. I sometimes go weeks without hearing them. Maybe they've said what they needed to say. Or maybe they're just at peace, knowing they won't be forgotten again." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Yates and Zara walked hand in hand to the memorial site. The simple wooden markers had weathered over the years, but they were still standing, each name visible in the moonlight. Wildflowers covered the ground, swaying gently in the night breeze. 10 years, Yates said softly. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years since I found you half dead with fever in that cabin, and heard me raving about crying in the night," Zara added with a small laugh. "Most men would have run for the hills." "I'm not most men," he pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "No, you certainly aren't." She looked up at him, her face serious in the moonlight. "You know, I've been thinking, the children are getting older, this school I've started is growing. Perhaps it's time we made it official." "What do you mean?" "I've been corresponding with the Territorial Education Board. They're looking to establish proper schools in this region." Her eyes shone with excitement. "I've proposed that we donate part of our land for a permanent schoolhouse, one that would serve children from all the surrounding homesteads." Yates considered this. Including Cheyenne children, from the reservation, especially them, it seems right, doesn't it, to create something that brings together the descendants of those who once were enemies, he nodded slowly. "It does, and where would this school be built?" Zara gestured to the flat area just beyond the memorial grounds. "There. So the students would pass by this place every day, so the story would be taught, not forgotten." The school board agreed to this, they did, with one condition. She took a deep breath. "They want us to give the memorial proper recognition, an official historical marker approved by the territory." Yates whistled low. "That won't sit well with some folks. There are people in power who'd rather this massacre stayed buried." "Which is exactly why it needs to be officially acknowledged." Her voice was firm. "I won't have Hope and William grow up in a world that buries uncomfortable truths." As they discussed the future of their land and the memorial, the night air around them stirred. Not with voices this time, but with a palpable sense of approval, of rightness, as if the very ground beneath their feet was sighing with relief. "I think they agree with you," Yates said softly. Zara smiled. "I think they've been waiting for us to take this next step." The following spring, construction began on the Harmony Creek School, named for the small waterway that ran through the Whitley property. The territorial governor himself attended the groundbreaking ceremony, along with representatives from the Cheyenne tribe and nearly every family within 20 miles. As part of the ceremony, a new memorial stone was unveiled, replacing the weathered wooden marker at the center of the burial ground. Carved into its surface was an official acknowledgement of the massacre, including the date, the names of those known to have died, and a promise that the site would be preserved and protected for generations to come. When the school opened its doors in the fall of 1889, 28 students enrolled, a mix of children from homesteader families, ranch hands children, and several from the Cheyenne reservation. Zara served as the head teacher, with a young woman from Denver assisting her. Hope and William thrived in the new school environment. Hope, now 11, showed a particular gift for languages, easily picking up the Cheyenne words shared by her indigenous classmates. William excelled in mathematics and science, already talking about attending university back east when he was older. One crisp October afternoon, as Zara was dismissing her students for the day, she noticed Hope lingering behind. When the other children had gone, her daughter approached with an unusual request. "Mama, can I bring some of my classmates to the memorial? The ones from the reservation." Zara studied her daughter's earnest face. "Of course, but may I ask why?" Hope hesitated. "They told me their grandparents talk about this place, about the people who died here. I thought maybe they might want to see where their relatives are buried." "That's very thoughtful, Hope. When would you like to do this?" "Tonight," Hope said quickly. "At sunset." "That's when they said the spirits are most likely to show themselves." Zara raised an eyebrow. "And who told you that, my friends?" When Zara looked confused, Hope added softly, "My other friends, the ones who live in the hills." That evening, 5 Cheyenne children returned to the Whitley farm, accompanied by 2 elders who had traveled with them from the reservation. Yates welcomed them warmly, offering food and coffee to the adults while the children gathered with Hope near the memorial. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, the elders led the children in a ceremony singing songs in their native language, burning sacred herbs, and speaking the names of those who had died in the massacre. Yates and Zara stood a respectful distance away, watching as Hope joined in the songs, her clear voice blending perfectly with the others as if she had known the melodies all her life. As darkness fell, something extraordinary happened. The air around the memorial seemed to shimmer, and in the gathering twilight, shadowy forms appeared, indistinct but unmistakably human figures moving among the graves. The Cheyenne elders grew still, their eyes wide. The children huddled together, not in fear but in wonder. Hope stood among them, her face serene, as if this manifestation was exactly what she had expected. One of the elders began to speak rapidly in Cheyenne. A boy about William's age translated in a hushed voice for Yates and Zara. He says the ancestors have gathered. They are pleased that their resting place is honored, that their story is being told. The boy paused, listening. He says they have been waiting for this night for their descendants to return and speak their names. For nearly an hour, the shadowy figures moved among them. No words were exchanged that Yates or Zara could hear, but the Cheyenne elders nodded occasionally, as if responding to communications only they could perceive. Finally, as the moon rose above the horizon, the figures began to fade. The elder who had spoken earlier raised his hands in what appeared to be a blessing. And then the night was still again, the only movement the gentle swaying of prairie grasses in the evening breeze. The Cheyenne visitors departed soon after, but not before the elder clasped Yates's hand firmly and spoke through the young translator. He says, "Your family has done what no others would do. You have bridged the worlds. The ancestors will remember this." After they had gone, Yates found Hope sitting alone by the memorial, her face thoughtful in the moonlight. "You knew they would appear tonight, didn't you?" he asked, sitting beside her. She nodded. "They told me it was time, that their families needed to see them to know they were at peace." "Your other friends told you this?" "Yes." She looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than her 11 years. "They've been teaching me things, Papa, about their world, about the space between worlds." Yates felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What kinds of things?" "How to listen, how to see." She took his hand. "Don't worry, it's a gift, not a burden. They chose our family because we chose to stay, to remember them when everyone else wanted to forget." Later, as Yates related this conversation to Zara, his voice betrayed his concern. "She speaks as if she's been given some kind of mission," he said, pacing their bedroom. Zara watched him from where she sat, brushing her hair at the small vanity he had built for her. "Perhaps she has. 2 hawks said she would have a special connection to this place." "But what does that mean for her future, for her life?" He stopped pacing, his face troubled. "I want her to have choices, Zara, to be able to leave this place if she wants to have a normal life." "Who says her life won't be normal?" Zara set down her brush and went to him, taking his hands in hers. "Normal is what we make it, Yates. Our normal has always included these spirits, these connections to the past. But Hope is special. We've always known that. But she's also just a girl who loves horses and reading and teasing her brother." She smiled up at him. "Whatever path she's on, we'll walk it with her." The manifestation at the memorial became a turning point. Word spread throughout the territory of the night when the massacre victims had appeared, of the Whitley family who had made peace with the spirits, of the school that now stood as a bridge between cultures. More Cheyenne families began sending their children to the school. The historical marker at the memorial site became an official stop on the territorial records, acknowledged by government officials who had once tried to erase the massacre from history. By 1895, the Harmony Creek School had grown to 50 students, with a new building constructed to accommodate the expansion. Zara oversaw a staff of 3 teachers now, dividing her time between administration and teaching the advanced classes. Hope, at 17, had become her mother's assistant, with a particular gift for teaching the youngest students. Her connection to the spiritual aspects of the memorial had not faded, but had matured into a deep understanding that she now shared with others, leading small, respectful tours of the site for visitors who came specifically to learn about the history and the unusual phenomena that sometimes occurred there. William, at 15, was preparing to attend university in Denver the following year, his interests turning toward medicine and science. Unlike his sister, he maintained a certain skeptical distance from the spiritual side of their homestead, though he never dismissed his sister's experiences. On a warm June evening, as the family sat on their expanded porch after dinner, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching their farm at a steady pace. As the figure drew closer, Yates recognized the distinctive feathered hat of Millicent Carter, the publisher of the Harmony Springs Gazette. "Mrs. Carter," Yates greeted her as she dismounted. "What brings you out this way so late?" Millicent, a formidable woman in her 50s who had taken over the newspaper after her husband's death, waved a telegram. "News, Mr. Whitley, important news that couldn't wait." Zara appeared in the doorway. "Please come in, I'll put on coffee." Once they were settled in the parlor, Millicent came directly to the point. "I've received word from my contact in Cheyenne City. The territorial legislature has passed a bill officially acknowledging the massacre that occurred here and establishing this entire area as a protected historical site." Yates and Zara exchanged looks of surprise. "The whole area?" Zara asked. "What does that mean for our farm, for the school?" "That's the remarkable part," Millicent continued, clearly enjoying her role as bearer of significant news. "The bill specifically names the Whitley family as permanent stewards of the land, with the school to receive territorial funding in perpetuity." Hope, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "They're acknowledging what happened, officially," Millicent nodded. "Yes, my dear, and there's more. The bill includes funds for a proper visitor center to be built near the memorial site, where the history can be properly documented and shared." "Who's behind this?" Yates asked, suspicious of sudden government interest in a story they had tried to bury for decades. "That's the most interesting part," Millicent smiled. "The bill was introduced by Senator James Redfeather." "A Cheyenne senator," Zara breathed. "I've read about him, one of the first indigenous senators in the territory, the very same. And in his speech supporting the bill, he mentioned your family by name. Called you examples of the reconciliation and honest reckoning with history that this territory needs." After Millicent left, the family gathered in the parlor to discuss this unexpected development. William, practical as always, immediately began calculating what the territorial funding would mean for the school's expansion plans. Hope sat quietly by the window, looking out toward the memorial grounds where lights sometimes appeared at night, floating lanterns that moved with purpose among the graves. "It's what they wanted," she said finally, drawing everyone's attention. "Not just to be remembered, but to have their deaths mean something, to change how people think about what happened here." Yates studied his daughter's profile in the lamplight. "You know this for certain?" She turned to look at him, her eyes clear and direct. "Yes, Papa. They've been telling me for years, but they needed the living to be ready to hear it." The visitor center was completed in the spring of 1896, a simple but dignified building constructed of local stone and timber. Inside, the walls told the story of the massacre through documents, photographs, and artifacts donated by Cheyenne families. A section was dedicated to the Whitley family and how they had transformed a place of tragedy into one of learning and reconciliation. On the day of the center's dedication, visitors came from throughout the territory, government officials, journalists, settlers, and a large delegation from the Cheyenne tribe, including Senator Redfeather himself. The ceremony took place at the memorial grounds, with speakers from both settler and indigenous communities. Hope, now 18, had been asked to speak as well, representing the younger generation and the school. As she stood before the gathered crowd, her voice clear and strong in the spring sunshine, Yates and Zara watched with pride from the front row. "This land has two stories," Hope began. "One of terrible violence and one of healing. Both must be remembered if we are to move forward together." She gestured to the memorial stones around her. "The people who died here were silenced in life, but in death their voices have been heard. They called out for remembrance, for justice, for peace between peoples who once saw each other only as enemies." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Many had heard the stories of crying in the night, of manifestations at the memorial, though few had witnessed them firsthand. "My parents could have fled when they heard those voices," Hope continued. "Most did before them. Instead they listened, they acknowledged, they honored." She looked directly at Yates and Zara, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And in doing so, they taught me the most important lesson of all, that the past must be faced honestly if the future is to be different." As Hope concluded her speech, a strange hush fell over the gathering. The spring breeze, which had been constant all morning, suddenly stilled. In the silence, many later swore they heard what sounded like distant voices singing a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The phenomenon lasted only moments, but its effect was profound. When the singing faded, Senator Redfeather stepped forward, visibly moved. "I believe we have just received the blessing of those we honor today," he said simply. "Let us be worthy of it." That evening, as the family sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Yates reflected on the long, strange journey that had brought them to this moment. "When I first heard you raving about crying in the night," he said to Zara, taking her hand, "I thought fever had addled your brain." She laughed softly. "And when you admitted you'd heard it too, I thought perhaps we were both going mad. Instead, it led us here." He gestured to their thriving farm, the school buildings in the distance, the visitor center just visible on the hill. "To a life I never could have imagined." Hope, sitting on the steps with her back against the porch railing, looked up from the book she was reading. "Would you change any of it?" "If you could go back," Yates and Zara exchanged glances, 17 years of shared history passing between them in a single look. "Not a single moment," Zara answered for both of them. Later that night, long after the household had gone to sleep, Yates woke to find Zara's side of the bed empty. Pulling on his trousers, he went in search of her. He found her at the memorial grounds, standing alone in the moonlight. As he approached, he realized she was speaking not to him, but to the night itself. "And I want you to know that we'll continue to protect this place," she was saying. "My children and their children after them, your story will be told, your rest will be peaceful." Yates stopped a few yards away, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a private conversation, but Zara sensed his presence and turned. "Come here," she said, holding out her hand. "I was just making a promise," he joined her, lacing his fingers through hers. "A promise to them," she nodded. I think they may be ready to move on. Hope says she hears them less frequently now. The crying stopped years ago. Even the singing comes rarely. You think they're leaving?" The idea brought a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Not leaving entirely, just finding peace. Knowing their story will continue to be told, that their resting place will be protected. As if in confirmation, a soft breeze stirred the wildflowers that covered the graves, carrying with it the faintest echo of a lullaby. "The cowboy said they cry at night," Zara whispered, echoing his words from so long ago. Yates smiled, remembering her response. "And you said, then let them hear my voice too." "And they did." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "They heard all of us." In the years that followed, the Whitley homestead continued to thrive. The school grew, eventually expanding to include a small college that specialized in training teachers for the Western Territories. Hope took over as headmistress when Zara decided to step back, bringing her unique perspective and abilities to the role. William returned from medical school in Denver to establish a practice that served both the town and the reservation. He married the daughter of a local rancher, building a home on the edge of the Whitley property. Yates and Zara, entering their later years with grace, remained at the center of it, all hosting Sunday dinners for their expanding family. welcoming visitors to the memorial site, and continuing to record the stories of both settlers and indigenous people who had shaped the region's history. The spiritual manifestations gradually faded over the decades, becoming rare occurrences rather than regular events. But on certain nights, particularly around the anniversary of the massacre, visitors to the memorial would sometimes report hearing distant singing or seeing lights moving among the graves. Hope never lost her connection to what she called the other side, but as she matured, she came to understand it as a gift rather than a burden. She never married, dedicating herself instead to the school and to documenting the unique history of their homestead. "You have no regrets?" Zara asked her once when Hope was in her 30s. "About staying here, about the path your life has taken," Hope had smiled, her face serene in the afternoon light. "How could I regret being exactly where I'm meant to be? They chose us, Mama. All those years ago, they chose our family to tell their story. What greater purpose could I have?" On a crisp autumn day in 1915, as the leaves of the cottonwoods along Harmony Creek turned golden, Yates Whitley passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63. He was buried on a gentle slope overlooking the memorial grounds, the school, and the home he had built with his own hands. At his funeral, attended by nearly everyone in the county, Zara stood straight and proud despite her grief. Hope on one side, William and his family on the other. As the minister concluded the service, a strange, beautiful thing happened. A sound like distant flutes and drums came floating on the breeze, though no musicians were present. The Cheyenne elders in attendance nodded in understanding. One leaned close to Zara and whispered, "They are welcoming him. The ancestors honor him as one of their protectors." Zara lived 5 more years, long enough to see her first great-grandchild born, long enough to witness the Whitley Memorial and School being featured in national publications as a model of reconciliation and historical reckoning. On her 80th birthday, sensing her time was growing short, she asked Hope to take her to the memorial grounds. There, sitting on a bench in the autumn sunshine, she looked out over the land that had defined her life. "I've been thinking about that night," she said to Hope. "That first night when Yates heard me talking about crying in the darkness." Hope took her mother's weathered hand. "When everything began. Yes, I was so afraid then, afraid of what I was hearing, afraid he would think me mad, afraid of being alone in this wild place." She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening, "But what seemed like a curse became our greatest blessing." "They led you to each other," Hope said softly, "and to us, they did, and now—" Zara looked toward the graves where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. "Now I think I'm ready to hear what they have to say next." 3 weeks later, Zara Parkerson Whitley passed away peacefully in the home she had built with Yates. She was buried beside him on the hillside, with the same distant music accompanying her journey. Hope, who inherited the homestead and continued her parents' work well into her 70s, would sometimes sit between their graves in the evening, telling them about developments at the school, about William's grandchildren, about the changing world beyond their peaceful valley. And sometimes, on particularly still nights, she would hear what sounded like her parents' voices mingled with the others, not crying anymore, but singing, talking, living their parallel existence in that space between worlds they had all come to understand. The land remembered. The spirits spoke. And the legacy of a courageous couple who had chosen to listen when others fled continued to transform lives for generations to come. "They cry at night," the cowboy had said. "Then let them hear my voice too," she had whispered. And in that simple exchange, in that moment of courage and compassion, a story that might have ended in forgotten tragedy had instead become one of enduring love, redemption, and peace.